the lessons from the life of Nebuchadnezzar have taken us to a very climactic point in this hour's study. It is entitled Hopeful Insanity. Is there such a thing as hopeful insanity? There is, because there's also a hopeless insanity as well, which we're going to be reading from the Spirit of Prophecy. The repeated awakening and reverses of Nebuchadnezzar's life and the discovery of the same in us, as we have been realizing as we've been reading the different things in the Spirit of Prophecy in the Bible, that we are learning lessons from Nebuchadnezzar that pertain to our own experience. And I have to tell you from my own experience that what I'm sharing you at this conference is my own experience. And I'm not sharing something with you by which some of you may have thought Brother John is having a go at me. Well, it just so happens sometimes in my conversations with you that we touch on certain things, and then what I prepared to represent the truth sometimes echoes as though I'm having a go at you because of what we talked about before. But no, that's not the case. I am simply sharing with you the truth which has affected me. And I have had to struggle with the things that, and I am struggling with the things that you are all struggling with no differently. But I thank God that He has been merciful to me, and I know He can be merciful to you too, as we open our hearts to this seesawing experience in our life between the natural heart and the inroads of God in our life, as we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's life. But this repeated awakening and then reverse of our experience comes to a point where we think, is there any hope for me? Am I ever going to make it? The interplay of conviction that comes from God's Word and the contrast of the dictates of the natural heart, they come like an avalanche, don't they? On top of you, when you know you shouldn't be doing something or shouldn't be acting in a certain way, but whoom, in comes this impulse. And this interplay of the convictions from God and the dictates of the natural heart, repeated again and again, drives an intelligent mind to distraction. And in the years of my observation in the medical world, in the psychiatric world, this repeated distraction through the ups and downs of our spiritual or emotional or general life that happens to people around, and it happens to us in the church. There are some people that end up with dementia because of that. There are some people who have exactly the same experience but do not end up with dementia because they have answers that help them out of that. And we are looking at a story today of King Nebuchadnezzar when he ended up with dementia. But God was working with him, and he came out of it. As we saw last night, Nebuchadnezzar slipped back one more final time from the convictions that God had given him. In the dream, the second dream, and the counsel that Daniel gave him, and he was touched. He was affected. However, within 12 months, he had slipped back again. And even, as we read, ridiculed the convictions he had, made fun of them. He, as it is written in the Scriptures, Galatians 5:17, was going through experiences of conflict between the Spirit of God that was working in him and his natural heart or his flesh. Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, reading verse 17. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary one to another, so that you cannot do the things that you would. We have seen a living example of this in Nebuchadnezzar. He praised and honored and glorified God. Then he turned against that. Then he praised again. Then he turned against that. He was playing out the inward battles of every human being who comes under the convictions of God. Apostle Paul, as he expressed it here, described it in his own life in Romans chapter 7. Romans 7 verse 23 and 24. He says, I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into the captivity of the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am! Who shall deliver me from the body of this death? His intelligent mind was bewildered by the conflict that was taking place within his being. Sister White writes, the Christian will feel the promptings of sin. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, but the Spirit striveth against the flesh, keeping up a constant warfare. Keeping up a constant warfare. And after a while, that gets too much for us. In the Bible Commentary, Volume 6, page 1111, Sister White writes, the life of the Christian is not all smooth. He has stern conflicts to meet. Severe temptations assail him. The flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. The nearer we come to the close of earth's history, the more delusive and ensnaring will be the attacks of the enemy. His attacks will grow fiercer and more frequent. Those who resist light and truth will become more hardened and unimpressible and more bitter against those who love God and keep His commandments. The spirit of prophecy talks about a gospel-hardened Christians. And that's what happens. It happens because the conflict between the spirit and the flesh. It happens because of what we have been watching with Nebuchadnezzar. And it happens to the people who are coming through the time of Jacob's trouble. Because Jacob, who was going to be redeemed totally, and we are to be totally redeemed if we continue under this message, we will meet the time of Jacob's trouble. And when Jacob met the angel, he thought what? He thought it was an enemy. But it was God. Nebuchadnezzar could have regarded the experience of God making inroads upon his life the way he did as an enemy. But no, both Jacob and even Nebuchadnezzar had their heart set in the right direction at the same time. And when Jacob recognized that it was a divine being that he was fighting, instead of saying, "Leave me alone," he grabbed him and wouldn't let him go. And we will see in our last study a very similar scenario with Nebuchadnezzar. But here is the truth of the matter. We are heading into an insane condition of the world. And unless we have this message that I am sharing with you here, we will go insane hopelessly. But if we take hold of this message, we will survive. Have you ever experienced these ups and downs, these glorious revelations of God, and then the negatives that come upon you, and you have been driven to mental exhaustion in the experience? Have you ever met that? I have. I really thought it was over and done for me. Ups, downs, then ups and downs, and up and down. And I can look back at my history to that particular point where I thought it was over, where mental exhaustion takes over and insanity is at the door. Especially if you are an intense person. Especially if you're a person whose nerves, remember we were reading there, don't wear your nerves on the outside. If you have a nervous condition, a nervous disposition that is very intense, this becomes more severe in our experience. There is something written about people who feel too deeply, people who are so intense. And it is written here in evangelism. It's evangelism, page 658, reading paragraph 6. She's writing to this brother, who is a ministering brother. And notice how beautifully she writes to him, and then she touches on this point. The Lord would have you, my brother, reform in your method of labor, that you may have a well-balanced mind a symmetrical character and spiritual strength to counsel wisely. Men who have experience in the knowledge of the truth are too few for you to be sacrificed. She's writing to this minister. And he is a man that she knows is a man who has experience in the knowledge of the truth. And she says to him, there are too few around in those days already for you to be sacrificed. You are almost constantly overtaxing both your physical and mental powers because you allow yourself to feel too intensely. You have a vivid imagination and put much intensity into your preaching, which keeps the mind on a constant strain. And this man was going to be lost to the work because it would have driven him to insanity. And she warned him. She said, there are too few men like you around for you to be sacrificed. Because why? You are constantly overtaxing your physical and mental powers because you allow yourself to feel too intensely. Because you have a vivid imagination and you put much intensity into your preaching and your mind is highly strung up. Then we read another quote from the Upward Look on the same issue. The Upward Look, page 276, paragraph 4 says, the deepest and truest philosophy of life and faith is to bring ourselves into the most intimate relation with God. I like that beautiful statement. What's that? The deepest and truest philosophy of life and faith. What is that? The deepest and truest philosophy of life and faith is to bring ourselves into the most intimate relation with God. God is giving you an experience, and if you do not grieve too much and feel too keenly, you will have physical strength. But sorrow and dissension and untruthfulness is to you a living death. But you must in faith commit your case to God. Truth will triumph and you will triumph with it. You want to be part of the church triumphant? This is material that we need to take to heart. So the beautiful relationship, the intimate relationship that is the truest philosophy of life and faith, that intimate relationship with God, we may have that experience if we do not grieve too much and feel too keenly. You know, with our intensity, we can overstep, and in German you say, überkandidelt. This can happen, and that's what she was writing to this minister. Don't let it happen to you because you're going to be sacrificed, and then we haven't got your witness and your experience. So this is where Nebuchadnezzar found himself. He had been so powerfully influenced, and that last dream he had was such a powerful witness to him. And here he had deviated back into his full pridey condition of this colourful character that he was, as the king of Babylon. And having had the dream, and now 12 months after, back in Daniel chapter 4, what happens? Daniel chapter 4, verses 29 to 33. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom of the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? Is not this that I have built for the house of the kingdom by my might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? Wasn't he exercising this intense attitude about himself? Look at me, what I have done. Wow. And as he utters that with such glorious intensity, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. At the intense moment of his glorifying of himself, with the enormity of this man's personality and character, oh, look at this, and he looked upon this glorious city that he had extended. And bang comes in the very vision that he had at 12 months before, where the language that is now uttered to his mind through the voice from heaven comes with just the same intensity. And the two intensities meet in his brain. And what happens? That same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. At the moment of uttering those words of pride, God's voice struck home. And there was the momentary reminder upon his mind of what the dream was and what Daniel had said to him. Can you picture the internal mind exercise here? Remembering what he did in his mind and in the expression of his mind when he had the first dream. He was an intense person. What did he do when Daniel finally explained his dream to him? He fell on his face. That's an intense person. He didn't just say, oh. He went falling on his face. He was a demonstrative person. His mind was demonstrative in himself. And the second time, when he saw those 3 young men walking in the fiery furnace, and he saw the Son of God Remember what we read there? His face went pale. His face went pale. You know, when pallor comes over your face, there is a mental exercise in there, isn't it? Remember in the time of Jacob's trouble, every face gathers paleness. Oh, exactly the same scenario. And so at this moment, having had all the mind experiences of the past, you know what happens? The mind does some fast things in a few seconds, doesn't it? Have you ever been in a situation where you came face to face with a serious, dangerous moment and brrr, the whole of your life comes up in front of you? This is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he was just saying those words and he was up in a crescendo of his imagination. Look at my glory, my majesty, look at my city. And then the words of God come from the intensity of his recognition of the past. And the brain goes, brrr. Everything comes up before it. Brrr, 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 brrr. And the mind goes into a state of freeze. His poor brain fell into a state of insanity. So what happened to this noble king whose heart had the two extremes lodged in it? What were the two extremes in his heart? A sense of justice. Remember it said an innate sense of justice and right. And a deep respect for God. And then the other side of it, an idolater. A proud-spirited mind resisting God's inroads at the same time. And so there it was in Daniel 4:33. That moment he became insane, and because they didn't have an insane asylum in those days, when somebody became insane or had leprosy or anything like that, he was sent out. That same hour he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. If you would have met him in the fields, you would have found a madman. We need to understand what insanity actually is. To most people, insanity is just somebody who's just non-cognito. He doesn't think. Well, that's not true. An insane person still thinks. And that was a big discovery for me when I was doing my nurses training, especially when I saw people who were unconscious. And to most people, and we had stories where the nurses were treating these unconscious patients, treated them like a bag of potatoes because they didn't know anything. And then when they came back to, they singled out that nurse and said, you know, you treated me like a bag of potatoes. And I knew everything that was going on. Insanity is not unconsciousness. It is not one where persons are not sensitive to the internal thoughts that run through the mind. They just can't control them. That's all. There was an example of this in the story of Mark 5, verses 1 to 3. Here you have just such a demonstration. Mark 5, reading there, verses 1 to 3. And they came over unto the other side of the Sea of Galilee, into the country of the Gadarenes. And when he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains. Here was a madman. He was also sent out, and he made his dwelling place in a cemetery among the tombs. In verse 5 and 6, as he came running down to Jesus, verse 4 says, because that he had often been bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces, neither could any man tame him. He was really a madman, wasn't he? And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. But when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him. Wow, a madman? And as he ran to worship him, he cried with a loud voice and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. Now, this is contrary, isn't it? He came there to worship, and what did he say? He couldn't control himself. This is insanity. What you want to say and what you want in your mind, you can't perform, because it's the other one. It's this conflict between the spirit and the flesh that makes people incapable, when there's a breakdown, to be able to think straight. I never forget the experience I made when I was nursing, where one of the nurses, nursing is a very traumatic experience, and some of the nurses had mental breakdowns, and this particular, he was a male nurse, in a senior one to me, he was a few years ahead of me, and he had a mental breakdown. I was on the ward at the time, and he was on my ward that I was working on, and he was howling in his bed. And so the doctor said, go and give him an injection. So I took the injection, and I had quite a pride about injections, because most of the time they didn't hurt. I gave some people injections. They said, I didn't feel that. I said, that was good. And I prided myself that I'm going to give him an injection. So I came over to him and I said, he was howling. He wasn't responding to me. And I pulled him and said, okay, turn over, Robert. And I pushed him over. And I said, I'm going to give you an injection. He just ignored me. He just howled. And then I threw the needle into his thigh, put it in and took it out. He just howled. He didn't respond, nothing. I put him back down, and then the drug worked, and he calmed down. That's all right. 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, he was, of course, back out, and he was back on the wards again. Then one day he came to me and he said, John, that needle you gave me hurt like crazy. And I thought, what? I learnt a lot when I did my nursing. Insanity is not unconsciousness. Insanity is consciousness with inability to control yourself. That's what it is. And in Desire of Ages, we see this stated beautifully in the Spirit of Prophecy. Desire of Ages, page 255, paragraph 4. The mind of this wretched sufferer had been darkened by Satan. Wasn't that the case with Nebuchadnezzar? Satan's influence and God trying to work upon him, it was all one big fuzz at the end. But in the Saviour's presence, a ray of light had pierced the gloom. He was roused to long for freedom from Satan's control. But the demon resisted the power of Christ. When the man tried to appeal to Jesus for help, the evil spirit put words into his mouth, and he cried out in an agony of fear. The demoniac partially comprehended that he was in the presence of one who could set him free. But when he tried to come within reach of that mighty hand, another's will held him. Another's words found utterance through him. The conflict between the power of Satan and his own desire for freedom was terrible. The conflict between the spirit and the flesh was terrible. Because the Spirit of God is one side of the experience, and the flesh, which is controlled by the devil, is another. And here in Nebuchadnezzar was the same scenario. Conflict between the power of Satan and his own desire for freedom, which was illuminated by God. And here we have what is the title of our study today: Insanity with Hope. Insanity with hope. In Desire of Ages 256, paragraph 2, it says, "The man praised God for his deliverance, because Jesus delivered him. The eye that had so lately glared with the fire of insanity now beamed with intelligence and overflowed with grateful tears." The people were dumb with amazement. They saw this. People don't understand insanity, and they don't understand the hopeful insanity. They don't understand what the actual scenario of activity is in the brain. So there it was. There is hopeful insanity. An insanity that comes from the conflict between the spirit and the flesh is an insanity that has hope in it. There is another insanity, and that is not hopeful insanity. It's discussed in Conflict and Courage, page 167. Conflict and Courage, 167, paragraph 2. Men cannot depart from the counsel of God and still retain that calmness and wisdom which will enable them to act with justice and discretion. Remember, inside of Nebuchadnezzar there was an innate sense of justice and right. Well, men cannot depart from the counsel of God and still retain that calmness and wisdom which will enable them to act with justice and discretion. As Nebuchadnezzar departed from the counsel of the Lord, he could no longer retain that. There is an insanity so dreadful, so hopeless, as that of following human wisdom unguided by the wisdom of God. Did you notice what was written here? There is no insanity so dreadful, so hopeless, as the one that follows human wisdom and refuses to be guided by the wisdom of God. That's hopeless insanity. Paragraph 5 says, this is what Saul, she's talking about King Saul, this is what King Saul could do under the control of Satan. When God had said that the iniquity of the Amalekites was full and had commanded him to destroy them utterly, he thought himself too compassionate to execute the divine sentence and be spared, and he spared that which was devoted to destruction. But now, without a command from God, under the guidance of Satan, he could slay the priests of the Lord and bring ruin upon the inhabitants of Nob. Such is the perversity of the human heart that has refused the guidance of God. And Saul, King Saul, had a hopeless insanity. And he went to the witch of Endor, as you know. This was a hopeless insanity. But with King Nebuchadnezzar, there was still an internal struggle of wanting to follow the guidance of God. And that's what caused him his insanity, because when the Lord said, remember the dream, and he threw the whole dream back at him, and now there was this hopeful insanity, because he still had that ingredient in him that he wanted to follow the counsel of the Lord. So Nebuchadnezzar's state of mind during his insanity was as the demoniac, not as Saul's. How do we know that that was the case? How do we know that he had a hopeful insanity, like the demoniac, who would recognize the God of the universe, but wasn't able to control himself because of the other one that made it so hard for him to control himself? What was it? How do we know? Daniel chapter 4, verse 34. Daniel 4:34 said, and at the end of the days, at the end of the 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honoured him that liveth for ever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. What did you just read there? All those 7 years he was insane in the battles of mind. Hin und her gerissen, that song in German, back and forth. And he could not get out of it. And after 7 years of this insanity, he finally decided to look up. He could do that. Just like the demoniac could see Christ and run to him. We read this reality from Evangelism, page 88. Evangelism, page 88, paragraph 1 says, God has presented to me the case of Nebuchadnezzar. The Lord worked with power to bring the mightiest king on the earth to acknowledge him as king over all kings. He moved upon the mind of the proud king until Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged him as the Most High God, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. God had worked on his mind through the first dream, then through the burning fiery furnace, then through the second dream, and after 12 months, God struck him to think again. And this time for the 7 years of insanity. Because during those 7 years, he was fighting back and forth in his brain, and he could not even think straight. He could not reason outwardly. His sanity was not capable because he was overburdened with the to's and fro's in his head. And as the Lord impressed him, the devil, the flesh, impressed him. Back and forth for 7 years. Until God kept on working on his mind. Until he acknowledged God. And what did we read there? After those 7 years, he looked up to heaven. It wasn't that God gave him his sanity back under some sort of arbitrary direction. He, Nebuchadnezzar, in the state of his insanity, came to a point where he decided to look up. And he received his sanity. Precisely the same as the demoniac ran to Jesus. And Jesus recovered him. Remember, his mind had been prepared by God-given dreams, by the furnace experience. That was lodged in his mind. The memory of that was lodged in his mind. Your memory can play reels of experience back to you, and your own responses according to the flesh can create this kind of problem. And so God worked on the mind of Nebuchadnezzar with the memories of his past, of bringing the power of God before him, causing him in his intensity to fall down and worship God and to give God the glory and to exonerate his servants. And all this was playing in his mind. If he would not in the past have been interested in God, do you think he would have been in an hopeful insanity? Not at all. In the mind activities, there is hope only for people who have already loved God and wanted to follow him. King Saul had turned against the memory of those things, and it was a hopeless insanity. But here was a hopeful one. And when in memory of his past experiences with God, he could look up to heaven. Let's read here, Daniel chapter 4, verse 24 to 26. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee. Now here's the word again, until. Until what? Until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. According to those words, you can see what I've been sharing with you is the exact truth. In the state of his insanity, he was able to discern the battle that was going on inside of him, and his flesh didn't want to let go. Satan didn't want to let go. At the same time, his heart was awestruck with God in the memory and so on. And so this went on until you knew that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men. Your mind, my mind also, in our internal mind conflicts, has been touched by the hope of the gospel. And when darkness and hopelessness wants to well over you, when the natural heart that you have discovered is so pronounced within you, you and I may be similarly intense. We are intense people. We feel deeply. And in that internal moment of darkest hopelessness within my thoughts, we are on the verge of hopelessness, thinking I'm gone, I'm lost, until memory is stirred by God. And what you do with that memory helps you back up. That was my own experience. I know what I'm sharing with you is true. In the darkest moments of mind activity, if you have had memories of your conviction and your overwhelming belief that God is your personal helper and you have acknowledged him, if that is there, then God will remind you until you will lift up your eyes to heaven. And this reality we must understand, not only for our own salvation, but as missionaries for Jesus, we must understand that for the souls that we are in touch with, trying to help. In the book Our High Calling, we read this. Our High Calling, page 295, paragraph 4. There are souls who err and who feel their shame and their folly. They are hungry for words of encouragement. They look upon their mistakes and errors until they are almost driven to desperation. Instead of reproving and condemning and taking away the last ray of hope
that the Son of Righteousness sheds into their hearts? Let your words fall as healing balm upon the bruised soul. Be not like desolating hail that beats down and destroys the tender hope springing up in the hearts. Leave not the hungry, starving soul in his helplessness to perish because you fail to speak what? Words of tenderness and encouragement. The lessons that we have seen throughout these studies must sink deep, and this one, as missionaries for Jesus, must sink in even more. Tenderness, meekness, humbleness is essential, that the little ray of hope that is still burning because God is working in the hearts of these people, we must as Christians not extinguish in another person. By what? By words like hail, by words of judgmental condemnation. There was a story that as I was researching the spirit of prophecy for the messages that I wanted to share with you, I came across one. You know the book, the article that Sister White wrote to Megan, and another one, Spalding and Megan. Brother Megan, his wife, they were both devout Adventists. And they loved the messages from Sister White. And in their deep sense of doing what God wanted to do, they wanted to fulfill what Sister White was saying. And they were very loyal. But Sister Megan was a very sensitive soul. And as she was waiting for Sister White to arrive over a particular situation that was in relation to what Sister White had said, and they wanted to follow, but somebody told Sister Megan that what Sister Megan was doing, Sister White was not in agreement with. And Sister Megan lost her sanity. She felt so deeply. And Sister White wrote that whoever did that was denounced by the Lord. They will have to meet the Lord in the judgment over that matter. But she did say that although Sister Megan lost her sanity, she died shortly after, she will be amongst the redeemed. But there are people, when something is stated, where they have this last hope and it is squashed, and by words of hail, they may be lost. So let the lesson that we are learning in regards to Nebuchadnezzar's insanity sink in deep as we meet people in the struggles of the conflict that they have. May God bless us, is my prayer. Amen.
One day